What's up everybody, Nate here, and the Federal Reserve so far this year has been aggressively raising its interest rates. Now, this is of course in a response to inflation. Inflation in June 2022 hit an over 40-year high of 9.1%. Right now though, the Federal Reserve raising their benchmark interest rates and trying to slow the economy hasn't really done all that much. Our labor market is still really strong, the housing market is still really strong, and the stock market has been booming over the last couple of months, basically coming out of a bear market. Today, the Federal Reserve released its minutes report, which gives us a behind-the-scenes look from its last meeting and, of course, what it's going to be doing with its monetary policy, including interest rates in the future. And things for the Federal Reserve are not looking good. I want to break down this entire report. I want to show you exactly what the Federal Reserve is planning on doing next, and I want to show you how the Fed is planning on flipping our economy in 2022. So in this minutes report, the Federal Reserve talked a lot about inflation and how they believe that inflation is starting to come down in our economy. They believe that the jobs market is really strong, and they believe that certain sectors of our economy are starting to improve because of their interest rate hikes. However, they also believe that interest rate hikes and continuing to raise their interest rates is what they're going to need to do in order to bring down inflation. So they basically said that they're going to continue to do that throughout 2022, and they're not going to stop until inflation reaches that target level of around 2%. As of July 2022, inflation was 8.5%, so the Federal Reserve has a long way to go in order to bring down inflation. And the Federal Reserve also mentioned in this report that when inflation starts to come down substantially, then they will probably start to lay off their interest rate hikes and kind of keep them at an elevated level for the foreseeable future. They didn't exactly say what substantially would mean, but we know that their target rate is around 1 to 3%, so I'd have to imagine that it's around there. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of this video that the Federal Reserve has been raising its interest rates very aggressively in 2022, and to their credit, they definitely have. They raised them earlier this year by 0.25%, then by a half a percentage point, and then by 0.75 basis points or percentage points. So that is pretty aggressive, and the federal funds rate currently sits at around 2.2 to 2.25% in the United States. Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell believes that this is neutral for its monetary policy, so the interest rate hikes are not hurting the economy, but they're not exactly helping either. That is part of the reason why we haven't seen economic disparity in 2022. These interest rate hikes are pretty much getting us back up to par with what we should be, and they're not aggressive enough in order to really combat inflation, but that might be changing as of September. We are not 100% sure what the Federal Reserve is going to raise its benchmark interest rates by in September of 2022. Their next FOMC meeting is scheduled for September 20th and September 21st, and that's when they're going to either raise things or lower them. Many experts and investors on Wall Street are saying that the Fed is going to raise its benchmark interest rates by 0.5% or 50 basis points, and the reason that they believe this is because inflation cooled off a lot in July 2022. In June, inflation was 9.1%, and then it went down to 8.5%. Now, the main reason for this is because gas prices started to decrease all throughout the country because OPEC was producing more, oil companies in the United States were producing more, and as prices went up, demand has slowly started to drop. Not only that, but it was perceived that the impact of the Russia and Ukraine war was going to cause gas prices to go through the roof, and it did for a short period of time, but it really hasn't caused a major spike in gas prices because Russia is currently working with China to send a lot of gas over there. So there's still a lot of countries that are using gas, which means there's still a good supply of it for the rest of the world, meaning the US can get just as much gas as it was before. Energy prices comprise around a third of the consumer price index, which means that with those prices coming down, inflation is also going to go down, but other countries throughout the world, and the United States included, are seeing other prices go up, like shelter costs and food costs. So that really means that inflation isn't tamed all that much, but from the Federal Reserve, inflation is drastically beginning to decrease because they look at other types of inflation numbers. For us and for regular everyday Americans, we look at overall inflation because we buy all sorts of different things. Like we have mortgage payments and we also also have to buy food and we have to spend money on energy. That is called your headline inflation numbers, and headline inflation was 8.5% in July. But core inflation, which is what the Federal Reserve likes to look at, actually decreased even more. It's only at around 6% in the United States, and that index actually takes out food and energy prices, the two most volatile things on the index. With that said, with energy coming down and food going up, the Federal Reserve doesn't really see that. The Federal Reserve also said that they are going to monitor the data, and depending on what the data says, they will adjust their interest rate policies accordingly. But honestly, no matter what the Federal Reserve decides to do, at this point, they are kind of screwed, because one way or another, they're probably going to hurt our economy. The Federal Reserve has a lot of power over the demand side of our economy, so people that want to go out and get a whole bunch of money in order to buy other things, they're going to get a loan out, and loans come with an interest rate. Loans come from a bank or other financial institution, and those banks or credit unions or whatever they may be have to borrow money from the United States government. When the government raises its interest rates, this makes it harder for banks to get their money, and they make it harder for you to use their money. That essentially slows demand in our economy for everything. That means that it's going to be a lot harder for somebody to go out and get a mortgage because the banks are raising their interest rates. Right now in the United States, an average 30-year fixed interest rate for a mortgage is around 6%. That is nearly double what we saw just a year ago. The same could be said in the auto market and in the business world. So it's going to be a lot harder for people to invest in businesses because they can't take out a loan. It's got to be all of their own money, and investors don't want to risk 100% of all of their money in order to invest in a business, especially businesses that are unproven and don't have a lot of profits in 2022. A lot of your tech IPO startups. So as the Federal Reserve raises their interest rates, a lot of that demand gets immediately sucked out of the economy, and at the end of the day, this means consumer spending is going to go down, and it means that millions of Americans are unable to get a mortgage or an auto loan. They simply can't qualify for one because the interest rate is way too high and the monthly payments would be way too high. It does not fit into their debt to income ratio. And you can probably guess what that means, and it's something that is currently happening in the United States right now. Demand for new mortgages is rapidly decreasing, and that means that new home sales are also starting to go down. At the end of the day, this ultimately gives inventory enough time to catch up in every single market. As prices go up, fewer and fewer people can afford all different things, so businesses will eventually have to decrease prices, or people will have to make more money in order to meet those prices. Wages are staying just below what the inflation rate is in 2022. They're up about 6.8% year over year, while inflation is up 8.5%. So Americans are still getting hit pretty hard where it matters, and that's their wallets. So the hope from the Federal Reserve is that they're going to raise their interest rates and slow down our entire economy just enough to where demand starts coming way down and businesses can produce more products, they can hire more people, and prices can eventually become stable all throughout the country. But there is a big problem with that in 2022. The Federal Reserve has to be careful to not raise interest rates too much because that's going to stifle demand all throughout the economy, and that means that people are not going to be able to buy anything. As it is, fewer and fewer people are able to go out and get a mortgage because interest rates are going up, and that's going to hurt the housing market pretty directly. But with businesses also taking a hit here, that means that we could start to see unemployment and layoffs grow in the United States. And layoffs are starting to grow in the economy. It starts with layoffs and then it turns into unemployment. The Federal Reserve also recognized this on their minutes report, saying that they believe that the jobs market is cooling off. They're starting to see unemployment slightly rise in the United States, while the amount of people actually quitting their jobs is going down, and the number of job postings is also starting to decrease. So what exactly does that mean? It means that businesses have a lot less money. They're not able to get money from investors because investors have to use all of their money in order to fund these businesses. They also can't take out any debt because debt is really expensive. Interest rates are going up, and new businesses can't really form to hire new people because, again, again, debt is hard to take on. A lot of people, especially small business owners, don't have the hundreds of thousands of dollars lying around in order to start a new business. They rely on debt, and you can't get it right now. As you have more unemployment and more Americans that don't have a job, that actually aids the Federal Reserve's plans because now fewer people have money to spend, and that naturally is going to bring down demand. Businesses will stop raising their prices so high, and people are not going to be able to afford their mortgage or get a new mortgage, so the housing market is going to come down. The stock market is going to come down because all of these businesses don't have as much money in debt or investor liquidity or in sales. So if the Federal Reserve continues to raise their interest rates aggressively and keeps them there for a long time, that could essentially send us into a really long and drawn out recession because now people don't have any money and no new money is being created. That process is starting now in 2022, and we know that because job postings are going down. 2021, the jobs market was booming. People were quitting their jobs voluntarily and they were job hopping. They were looking for better benefits, better pay, and a better work-life balance. And they had the means to do so because now they could go out and businesses were going to throw money at them because in 2021, interest rates were extremely low and stimulus was very high. There was so much money circulating throughout our economy that businesses were able to just hire people left and right. But what they're finding out in 2022 is they may have overhired. They had way too much money and now all of that money is starting to disappear. Businesses also have extra costs too. The producer price index is also going up and hitting over 40-year highs just like the consumer price index. This means that businesses are taking on extra costs and they don't have as much money. All of that money that they did have doesn't take them as far because inflation is so high. And that's really on the Federal Reserve because back in 2021, a lot of investors and experts were saying that the Federal Reserve needs to step in and start raising its benchmark interest rates very high. You got to remember the Federal Reserve was also on Wall Street purchasing billions of dollars every single month in treasury notes and bonds. So they were stepping in and providing all of this extra liquidity. Now businesses don't have any of it. The Fed is going through a process called quantitative tightening right now, which is basically a process where they take all of those bonds that they've bought and they start selling them, but people aren't really willing to buy them in 2022. So all of that money is just sitting there and the Federal Reserve is just letting it roll off and they're not reinvesting. That means no new money is being created, so all of these businesses have nothing to invest. And what's worse, a lot of your tech startups have no profits to begin with, so they just simply aren't going to survive, and you're probably going to see a string of bankruptcies throughout this year and into 2023, which means unemployment and layoffs. Like I said, if the Federal Reserve started to raise its interest rates aggressively in 2021, we probably wouldn't be facing a lot of these problems, but the Federal Reserve was in a really tight spot because they didn't know what was going on with the pandemic and they didn't want to start raising and lowering and raising things again, depending on if things got out of control and we had more economic lockdowns. So that was tough, but they've been talking about raising interest rates since I think November of 2022, and they didn't actually start to raise interest rates until March of this year. I think that is the window where they really missed an opportunity. So the question is, what happens next? I think the Federal Reserve is going to continue to get aggressive on inflation, and I think that our next inflation numbers, the ones for August 2022, are going to show that inflation has not cooled completely in our economy. Maybe certain things are starting to go down, but the vast majority of things are going up in price. That means the Federal Reserve is going to have to raise its interest rates by at least a half a percentage point, if not more. We could see a 75 basis point hike or a full percentage point hike, depending on the numbers. In the long term, this is going to mean that inflation comes down. It's naturally going to come down because people are going to have less money, things get a lot more expensive, and people just don't want to spend. They're going to save instead. Now that's going to bring down our GDP. That's going to cause our economy to slow way down. It's going to be an economic downturn. The Federal Reserve has to be careful though to not go in the opposite direction. Remember, the Federal Reserve controls demand with its monetary policy. They can just lower interest rates and they can just print a bunch of money and then our economy will start booming again. But the other thing that will boom is inflation. But now I want to hear from you on this issue. What do you think about the Federal Reserve and its latest minutes report? Do you think the Federal Reserve is screwed, or do you think that they can actually somehow create a solution solution to this inflation problem relatively quickly. Whatever your thoughts are, leave a comment below before you go. But that is it for today's business and financial news breakdown. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to stay up to date with all the top business and financial news from around the country, our team puts together a free daily newsletter, and you can subscribe to it by clicking the link in this corner right here. And if you want to stay up to date with me and everything else happening in the business and financial world, I'm putting out updates 7 days a week over here on this channel, and I've actually got another one ready for you right here, so be sure to check that out before you go. That is it for me, everybody. Be kind out there, and I'll see you all in the next one.